My name is Matt Taylor. I'm the Protestant scholar at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies in Baltimore. And at the ICJS, we build learning communities to help promote interreligious learning and collaboration. And we also challenge the forces of religious bigotry like anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and Christian supremacy. And we'll be talking some about Christian supremacy and Christian nationalism today with Dr. Bradley Onishi. Our guest here is Bradley Onishi, and Brad is a scholar of religion. He co-hosts the Straight White American Jesus podcast, which I recommend to everyone. And he has degrees from Azusa Pacific University, from Oxford University, and l'Institut Catholique de Paris, as well as a PhD from the University of California, Santa Barbara. And Brad is currently faculty at the University of San Francisco, and he is the author of the newly released, as of 3 days ago, Preparing for War, The Extremist History of White Christian Nationalism and What Comes Next. And we'll be talking about his book today. So throughout the event today, the audience will be muted. But as you have questions that come up, as you have things that you'd like to ask Brad, feel free to put those in the chat, and we'll be kind of collecting those questions, and we'll have some time at the end for Brad to take on those questions. So we're going to talk about your book in a few minutes, Brad, but we actually broke some news a couple hours ago. Brad and I published a piece together in Religion Dispatches just this morning, revealing that there were some previously unknown connections and collaborations between some Christian nationalist leaders and the Trump White House in the lead up to January 6th. So that piece was just, the link was just put in the chat for those of you who didn't get a chance to read it just yet. And Brad, maybe we can just start off for a couple minutes talking about that. What do you think the significance of this finding of these connections between these leaders and the Trump White House is, and how does it change the narrative about January 6th, do you think?
Yeah, I think we should be specific. The finding is your finding. You're the one who found it, and everyone who's in the room should know that Matt really did some field-changing work to uncover all of this. And so when you read the piece, I got to contribute, but Matt really is the one who provided all the original material there and all of the primary documentation. If I analyze what I think it means, I think what it shows us is a couple of things. One, that as you and I and others have maintained for some time now, Christian nationalism was an integrating force for January 6th, and it was a mechanism that really provided a story and a set of rituals, a set of symbols for people to use and to justify their actions that day. On a more nuts and bolts level, I think we now have some pretty good evidence that the Trump White House understood that if they mobilized certain Christian leaders and communities, that they could build I want to use the right word here, they could build a critical mass of people that would help them in their efforts to overturn the 2020 election. And they were very successful in that. I mean, if you look at the recordings, the evidence, the speeches, the sermons, the language they use is one of warfare and taking back the country. So that's what's in my mind this morning, Matt, as the piece went live, but curious what you think as you were able to get to see it go public and realize it's now out in the world.
Yeah, I mean, the thought that keeps coming to me is the group that we're looking at in that piece comes out of the independent charismatic world, and specifically this leadership network called the New Apostolic Reformation. This is a world that the American media has not paid very close attention to. And so while, at least from everything that we show in the piece, and you and I just over the last few months have recorded an audio documentary series about this same movement called Charismatic Revival Theory, and I think we can drop that link in the chat as well, that really documents this in an even more profound way. I think the Trump White House evidently knew the mobilizing potential of this movement, and yet the American media was not paying attention to it and was not watching closely. And so you see these manifestations of things like the Jericho marches or January 6th, but the organizing and mobilization campaign that went into that was not being noticed and was not being paid attention to. And I think if we keep ignoring that world, we may be blindsided again.
Well, and when you say mobilization, it's easy to think of that as just like, hey, I'm a pastor telling my people that Trump's the rightful president. Let's pray for that. I mean, what we're talking about here is mobilization in the form of people encouraging their congregations, their followers, their people listening to them on Facebook Live. You should be at the Capitol. And if you can't get there, you should help others get there. I mean, it's that kind of mobilization, not the, hey, let's pray for President Trump and then go to lunch after church kind of mobilization.
Right. And if you listen to our series, we include the audio of a lot of these leaders, and you can hear them in their own voices. You can hear exactly what they're saying. You can hear the tone of it, the violent rhetoric that they're using. It was not a passive or kind of genteel campaign. So as we turn to your book, Brad, we're here on the 2-year anniversary of January 6th, right around this time of day, that day. I was glued to the TV. Many of us were. We were starting to notice this crossover from the event at the Ellipse that Trump was speaking at, as these crowds start moving across the National Mall towards the Capitol. And by the time we're ending this call, we would have people breaching the Capitol 2 years ago. Where were you that day, and how did you kind of begin to hear this news, and what were you thinking as that happened?
Yeah, so I have a very California story for you. I live in Northern California, and if folks remember, the night before was really the Georgia runoff. So this is when we kind of learned that Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff would be in the Senate, and there would be this very surprising slim majority, and all of a sudden you have Biden and the House and the Senate all in place. So I was in a pretty good mood, unexpectedly. If you know me, I'm pretty good at pessimism, but not a morning person. But I got up at dawn and I went surfing, and I got over to the water, jumped in, was all alone, and was feeling like I was expanding my horizon just as the country was entering a time of like maybe of expansion and recovery and something. And I remember taking this selfie like when I got out of the water, just because I was like, this is a good morning. It's a good morning, and I feel pretty good. Let's take a picture of this and remember it. And as soon as I got home and got in front of the computer and the television, as you say, Matt, all of the folks were streaming across my screen and entering the building. And it just got worse and worse and worse as the day went on. And I know we'll talk about this more in a minute, and I talk about it in the book, but it really hit me very soon into that process that I could have been there, because I was once part of churches and communities that were sending people. I guess I'll say, maybe that's too strong a word, and that if I had maybe not left the movement, or if I had been born a little bit later and converted in 2017 rather than converting when I did, maybe I would have been one of the people that thought that was what God wanted me to do, was to get on an airplane and go be a godly patriot who was fighting for his country. And that's really scary to admit to yourself, but it was important for me to do it.
So, Brad, as we have, there's going to be all kinds of media coverage and reflective pieces. And I mean, the January 6th committee just released their report within the last couple of weeks. We've got all this new documentation, indictments, there's been a ton of ferment around this, just even within the last few months. As you think back on the last 2 years, and as you look at what the January 6th committee has done, how do you evaluate their work? And as you said, Christian nationalism, or white Christian nationalism, was kind of an integrating force for this. Why is it crucial to understand Christian nationalism in connection to the Capitol riot?
So I think let me just start back in the weeks and months after J6. What I wrote then, and it's something I stand by now, is that if we had a unanimous denunciation of that day by our political and cultural and religious leaders, we might have been able to evaporate the air from our ether. We might have been able to really stamp it out, but we didn't. In the days and hours we had after J6, we had Lindsey Graham and Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy all condemned the attack, and however, soon thereafter, many of them recanted or kind of were wishy-washy on how they felt about it. We had Congress people talk about it as a normal tourist visit. We had, basically people celebrating the J6 rioters and so on. Religious leaders on the right did the same thing. Tucker Carlson and many others have continued in a kind of sense of commemoration rather than a sense of denunciation. That didn't happen. The unanimous denunciation did not happen, and as a result, the big lie has turned into something that now has a commemorative day. So J6 was not the end, but for many people, it was the day they remember as the beginning. And there are relics, there are martyrs to this myth now, and in order to commemorate this day, Ashley Babbitt was a woman who was killed that day trying to enter the chamber. Well, there are flags and patches and commemorations to her. Glenn Youngkin down in Virginia is now governor, and when he was running, there was a campaign where his supporters raised a flag so everyone could say the Pledge of Allegiance. But the flag they raised was a flag that was used by people storming the Capitol at January 6th. So the story, the myth, now has rituals. It now has relics. It now has commemoration. And that means it's going to grow. As I show in the book, more people in 2022 believe the big lie than believe the big lie on January 6th itself. So it's not gotten better. It's gotten worse in some sense. So I think that's important to think about. And then as we've progressed these 2 years, there has just been incredible work by scholars of religion and journalists, whether that is the Freedom from Religion Foundation and the Baptist Joint Committee and their report on J6, whether that is the Smithsonian and the University of Alabama and their Uncivil Religion exhibition, whether that's work by you, Matt, and many other scholars of religion who've pointed out that when you investigate January 6th, what you find are a plethora of religious symbols and signs and detailed. I mean, there's the Christian flag, there's the Confederate flag, there are medieval Crusader flags, there are appeal to heaven flags that are related to the charismatic Christianity you mentioned earlier, Matt. Christian nationalism, and you might say, well, what does that do? Why was Christian nationalism such a big part of this? And I'll wrap up by saying this. I don't want to give too long of an answer. I apologize. But what Christian nationalism provides on January 6th is a story that turns the rioter into a warrior. It turns the insurrectionist into a godly patriot. At almost every turn of taking some part of that building, whether getting up on the mezzanine, getting into the hall, getting into the chamber itself of the Senate, a group would stop to pray. And the prayers, if you listen to them, are, God, thank you for bringing us here as your people in the people's house to do your will. And when you can say prayers like that, what you're doing is you're creating a story that says, I'm not an interloper. I'm not a trespasser. I'm not a criminal. And I'm certainly not a treasonous actor. I'm a godly warrior. I'm sent by God to do his will. I'm the one who has the courage to do what needs to be done. We are the patriots and we are the Christians. And whether or not you go to church every Sunday, whether or not you're an oath keeper and you haven't been to church in 2 years, maybe you're a Proud Boy and you don't know one Bible verse. Maybe you're a pastor, and there were many pastors at J6 who were up there praying. That story, that integrates you all into the same narrative and the same cause. And all of a sudden, you have a way that you're on the same side and you're all trying to accomplish the same mission. So Christian nationalism is a great way to integrate a number of different forces and groups into what amounts to one of the worst attacks on our capital in the nation's history.
So one of the things I really like about your book is you make it very personal. You integrate your story and you kind of thread your story through these different chapters. So the chapters are analyzing deep segments of American history, deep parts of the American psyche, but then your story is also a part of that. So I'm assuming that in the last 3 days, most of our audience has not read your book. So maybe just give us some of the broad outlines of your story, how you came into white evangelicalism and how you left it.
Yeah, thanks for asking. And this really is a personal story for me. So I didn't grow up in a religious house. I have a Japanese American dad who's Buddhist growing up, and a mom who was nominally Christian, and just didn't grow up with religion as part of my upbringing. But at 14, I converted. I was invited to a weeknight Bible study by a girlfriend. And I thought, well, this is when you're 14, you don't get to usually go see your girlfriend on a Wednesday night. And there's no way mom will say no to this because it's church. So I went, and I thought it would just be something I did for fun and laughs. And it wasn't. I converted, and I converted in a pretty extreme way. By the time I was 20, I was a full-time minister. I was married, and I was finishing at a Christian college out in Los Angeles, and on my way to seminary. Well, over the course of the next couple of years, I began to read widely. I began to come into contact with folks from different Christian traditions, different faith traditions, and just different worldviews. And I started to really think of the very important political and ethical issues of our time is more complex than the kind of either or scenarios that I often heard at church, whether that was on abortion, whether that was on stem cell research, whether that was on immigration. And I remember the election for between John Kerry and George W. Bush, and I was really determined to vote for John Kerry. And my elders said, "Hey, it's great if you want to vote for him. He may help more people who are underprivileged economically. He may provide shelter for more immigrants. But if you vote for someone like him, you're voting for the murder of millions of babies. So do you really want to do that?" And I was haunted by those sayings. But as I was in that voting booth, I had this moment where I just thought, how can the most important issue be just reduced to this just like either or logic? It can't be that simple. And so that really set me on the path to leaving the community. I went to graduate school in England, and eventually became a scholar of religion, and obviously, have a much different worldview these days than I did 10 or 15 years ago.
So, Brad, you and I are both from Southern California, and we both have had long sojourns in Orange County, California. And one of the things I find really interesting in the book is that you really anchor the narrative of Christian nationalism in California, and in Southern California especially. I think for most people who have only visited California or who have watched TV shows that center on California, that might seem like a surprising move, right? Most people's impression of California is kind of the idyllic scene that you had 2 years ago, people surfing, hippies, kind of the Silicon Valley, Hollywood. Why is it important to put Southern California at the heart of a narrative about Christian nationalism in the US?
Yeah, and I know, as a Californian who's lived all over the country, Tennessee and Virginia and New York and other places, I know that every other American hates hearing about California. So I get it. I know right now some of you are rolling your eyes, and so I apologize for that. But if you'll just stick with me, I think there is an important aspect to all of this. I love talking about this, so you'll just have to forgive me for a minute. I really feel like this is a place where I love to get kind of nerdy. In the mid 20th century, you have something called the Sun Belt migration. And you might have heard of the Great Migration, the migration of many African Americans north in the 20th century. But the Sun Belt migration is really a time when millions of Southerners and Midwesterners move west and really reshape the demographics of the nation. This is how California becomes the most populous state in the Union. Why were they doing that? They were doing that for defense industry jobs. So after World War II, the defense industry really was headquartered in the Southwest, including Los Angeles and Orange County. And so you have all these people who are moving in the 1950s and 60s for well-paying jobs, at the time, cheap real estate and sunny weather and no winter and all that kind of stuff. So they thought, hey, this is really a good deal. Well, what happens is those Southerners and those Midwesterners, they reshape Southern California in their image. They have a chance in a place like Orange County that is really an unzoned lot. It's like an empty parking lot, an empty lot. What are you going to build here? What do you want to put here? Your choice. Go ahead, draw up the blueprint and put it in place. Well, they were able to create what I think was a nostalgic version of the United States or the small towns or the America they left in the South and the Midwest. It was a nostalgic version because it wasn't one that actually existed. It's just one that they thought existed or wish existed or wanted to exist. So in the 1950s and 60s, a place like Orange County transforms from a kind of bucolic farm region into the epicenter of the new conservative movement in the United States. And I know you're saying, that sounds crazy. But let me give you a concrete example. In 1964, Barry Goldwater is the GOP nominee for president. Some of you remember this. Barry Goldwater was the Arizona senator. So he came from the region we're talking about, the Southwest. He was very brusque. His sister said he'd never read a book cover to cover, was not interested in book learning, was interested in bombastic statements about using nuclear weapons in Vietnam. He was hypermasculine, baritone voice, squared jaw, okay? Well, he was a long shot. Candidate was supposed to be Nelson Rockefeller. But organizers in Southern California from the John Birch Society got behind him. And they pushed him over the finish line in California. And eventually he won the GOP nomination in 1964. He would have never been there without all of that Southern California influence, okay? Now, I'll come back to Goldwater here in a second, but the John Birch Society is another great example of Southern California being this epicenter of this new conservatism. John Birch Society was supposed to be a anti-communist organization, pro-Christian organization. But many of you know the John Birch Society was a conspiratorial organization. John Birch Society and its leader, Robert Welch, believed that Dwight Eisenhower, of all people, was a Soviet agent. Earl Warren, the Supreme Court Justice, Martin Luther King Jr. They taught that the new sex ed and health curriculums being instituted in public schools meant that school teachers were taking their clothes off and using their own bodies to teach anatomy to fourth graders. These kind of conspiracies were abound in Southern California suburban communities at coffee meetings with housewives and after church potlucks. This is the region that eventually gives us not just a Barry Goldwater nomination, it gives us Richard Nixon. My hometown, my home church is Richard Nixon's hometown and his home church. This is the region that gives us Ronald Reagan. It's the region that celebrates and was the spiritual home of John Wayne. The airport in Orange County, California is still called John Wayne Airport. Staunchly libertarian, pro-capitalist, pro-America Hollywood figure. I could go on. Pat Boone, blah, 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 blah. Not to mention that Focus on the Family was founded only 20 minutes away at the border of LA County and Orange County. All of this to say that Southern California has a Bible Belt, and that Bible Belt has been a site of innovation and cultivation of conservative white Christianity and libertarian politics since the mid-20th century. And that part of the story, to me, is really important in understanding where we are today.
You have a little brief anecdote in the book about your dad, who was Japanese American, driving from LA to Orange County and being very anxious because he was just aware of how people of color were treated by the police and by other forces in Orange County. And I was an undergrad at the University of California, Irvine, which is right there at the heart of Orange County. And I remember talking to my friends who were people of color and just the very different way that they were treated in Orange County, even compared to other parts of California. So this is not kind of ancient history. This is within the last 25 years. So we both work on Christian nationalism. We both teach on Christian nationalism, write on this stuff. One of the things that I find really challenging in writing about Christian nationalism, talking about it, teaching about it, is that it's a very powerful narrative in American history. And as you show in the book, some of these threads of Christian nationalism, of the politics of Christian nationalism, don't just go back 50, 60 years, they go back 160 years. They go back to the founding of the US, where you have people trying to kind of blend together Americanism and Christianity. And so all these kind of the backlash we're seeing today that people talk about as Christian nationalism has some very deep roots in our history. So how do you teach American history in a way that is honest about the role that white Protestantism and white Catholicism has played, and the way that that has been an organizing force in American history and American politics in the past, but that doesn't give in to this kind of teleological assumption that therefore we're a Christian nation and we need to make Christianity the official religion? How do you teach in a way that's honest to that past, but that also helps Christian nationalist leaning people think differently about America?
Yeah, this is such a great question, and it's so important. And I think that for me, the issue is not nothing I'm ever writing or teaching is meant to say, yeah, of course there were no white Protestants or white Catholics in our history. That's crazy. No, of course there were. And they have a decisive influence on, everything from the Massachusetts Bay Colony to the history of Maryland and so on and so forth. Okay. The problem is with the simplicity and the reduction, right? The problem for me is not the history. The problem is the history is rarely what people actually want to talk about. And so I think teaching, the word, when you say, how do you teach this? This really sets off a set of light bulbs for me, because teaching is a chance for us to go from headlines, to go from sound bites, to go to nuance, to go to detail, and to go to complexity, and say, hey, we have a really important set of factors at play here. There are a lot of folks that want to jump ahead to the conclusion. The conclusion is, this is a Christian country. This is not a Christian country. Which one is it? Let's do the long division. Let's do the work. And when we do the work, we see, of course, the overwhelming decisive influence of white Protestant people, white Catholic people, and so on. But we also start to notice that story, if it's only told in that way, is incomplete. It's often told in a way that is misguided and misleading. It often leaves out the many other religious traditions that were present and have been present, if not from the founding, very close there too. And so when I teach these things, my goal is not to say, well, everything you know about there being white Christians here is wrong. It's to say, we need to complexify, we need to add, we need to make sure that we see detail, we need to zoom in certain places, because the impulse is just, let's zoom out and let's argue on Twitter about whether it's a Christian country or not. And that is where Christian nationalism, so today we're talking about Christian nationalism. Most Christian nationalists just want to skip to the conclusion and then get to their agenda. Of course, it's a Christian country, Christian founders, Christian history. So it still should be a Christian country. It still should have what I think are Christian values and policies. And I'm only going to elect Christian leaders who talk in a certain way and identify in a certain way and have what I want in mind. That to me is not a matter of history or doing any kind of difficult analysis. That's just, I already have the conclusion I want. I'm going to run with that. And then if I'm asked to show the receipt, I'll show you, but it's going to be incomplete, it's going to be reductive, and it's going to be simplistic. And so teaching is just one of those very few spaces we still have left, right? Where we get to sit down for a bunch of hours a week and work through it. Try to form narratives and visions that actually do justice, right, to the history, to the story. And I'll just say, and this is for all those folks that are trying to find ways to talk to people that would say that you're un-American for denying our history. I would say, you know what I think the most American thing to do is? In the land of liberty, the nation of immigrants, the place where every person of every creed and every background and every ethnicity is supposed to get a fair shot. Man, I think the most American thing you can do is get in there and do the hard work to attend to the beautiful diversity, this stunning array of stories and histories that mark the American founding, whether that is the enslaved person who is a Muslim, whether that is the Jewish communities that are in the Mid-Atlantic or in the Northeast, whether that is the Chinese Buddhists who are having their Buddhist temples burned down in San Francisco, the Japanese Americans who are incarcerated, and so on and so on and so on. Is there anything more American than actually paying attention to the stories and histories of all of us? I don't think there is. That's not un-American. That's the most patriotic thing I can think you could spend your time doing.
Yeah, I like that reframing of it. Just a reminder to our audience, as you have questions for Brad, put those in the chat. We're kind of gathering those, and we'll have some time in about maybe 10 minutes or so for some audience questions. So Brad, we just came through a midterm election that caused a lot of consternation for a lot of people in the lead up to it. You had these figures like Doug Mastriano and Carrie Lake and outright election deniers, and most analysts were pleasantly surprised that a lot of these kind of gathering forces of Christian nationalism that we were worried might stage another takeover of American politics or attempt another takeover, they lost, and lost soundly in many cases. So how do you read the trend lines right now? What are we out of the woods with this Christian nationalist backlash? Can we kind of think about other things now moving forward after these 2 years?
I think the short answer is no, but let me explain myself. And I want to start with the good news. And I want to say that I agree with you that in the 2022 midterms, there were a lot more positive results than I think people expected, that many of the election deniers who ran for Secretary of State did not win. As you say, in Arizona and Pennsylvania, the governors are not election deniers. They are not adherents to the big lie. Trumpian candidates, just be clear, in many cases were not successful. We also had many people turn out to vote in favor of reproductive rights in ways and in places that many felt were unexpected, Kansas being maybe a good example of that. There are really hopeful and positive things to see in the results of the 2022 midterms. We have governors in Oregon and in other places who are openly lesbian and part of the LGBT community, and so on and so forth. I could keep going with some of the good news. But I also think it's a mistake to think, as you say, that we're out of the woods. I think there's some examples of that are pretty clear. We've been watching the debacle in the House of Representatives over the last week, and front and center are people who really only are there because of Trumpist forces. So Lauren Boebert narrowly won her race. Marjorie Taylor Greene is still a congressperson in this country. Matt Gaetz nominated, and I think this is just worth sitting on for a minute. A day before the 2-year anniversary, Matt Gaetz nominated Donald J. Trump to be the Speaker of the House on January 5th, 2023. So they are all still present. They are in essence holding hostage the Republican Party until they get their way. And those 20 folks that are opposing Kevin McCarthy are some of the most Trumpian representatives of Congress that we have. The other thing that I want to point out is that Ron DeSantis won handily down in Florida. And Ron DeSantis, I think, is a very good example of how Trumpism can and might continue, even if Trump is no longer part of the GOP or American politics. Ron DeSantis is not nearly as bombastic as Trump. He's not nearly as good on camera. He's not nearly as spectacular or rhetorical. I'm not sure he could vanquish the Chris Christie's and Marco Rubio's on the debate stage like Trump did 7 years ago. But Ron DeSantis is doing two things. He's running to the right of Trump on vaccines and education and migration. He's continuing the Trumpian playbook by doubling down on it. And he's very popular as a result. He's also much better at governance. He's actually somebody who understands how to get things done in and through government, where the Trump administration largely did not. There was a lot of folly. Infrastructure week lasted for 150 or 160 weeks, it seemed. Ron DeSantis is much more like Viktor Orban over in Hungary. He knows how to use democracy against itself. He knows how to put in place illiberal policies that will have the sheen of democracy and liberalism. So are we out of the woods? I don't think so. And I think that's the wrong way to look at it. And I'll just close on this. I think the right way to look at it is that this is an active set of exercises that we have to do to have a democracy. Democracy is a verb. We enact it in the ways that we vote and organize and act. It's not something that you do once or you do every 4 years and think, well, I'm glad I did it. I know some of us go to the dentist every 6 months and we feel like, well, did that, don't have to do it again for 6 months. But some of us are also thinking, hey, it's the new year. I'm going to eat healthier, or I'm going to go to the gym. And I have certainly done this many times. You know, you go to the gym January 3rd and you think, that was good. All right, glad I did it. And I'll be back in June, right? Well, that doesn't do much. You know, eating healthy for one meal on January 3rd is not going to drastically change your diet or anything else, right? Well, it's the same with democracy. To think that we're just out of the woods when Lauren Boebert is yelling on the floor of the House of Representatives, when Donald Trump's being nominated for Speaker, and when Ron DeSantis is flying migrants to Martha's Vineyard, and the governor of Texas is flying migrants to Kamala Harris's house on December 24th, Christmas Eve. I think it's pretty mistaken to think that the anti-democratic forces are no longer with us.
I'm glad you brought up Ron DeSantis, because we already got a question from our audience about him. So this is going to be my last question, and then we'll turn it over to the audience questions. But I wanted to tailor a question for the audience, the type of people who show up for our ICJS events. So we're an interreligious institute. We do a lot of work in the community. We have Muslims and Jews and Christians and people who don't identify with religion at all, but who feel like interreligious dialogue is a really important thing, who participate in the things that we do, events like this. And so what's their stake? If for people who are not Christians, what's their stake in all this? Can we engage Christian nationalists in dialogue, or do we just need to denounce the thing? And for those of our audience members who are Christians, but who look at something like January 6th or read your book and say, that's not my Christianity, yeah, what's their responsibility in times like these?
Yeah, great questions. I think what's the stake for the person who's looking at all of this from the outside? And I think the stake is twofold. I think on a civic level, the stake really comes down to, do we want a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, pluralistic democracy or not? And if we do, then I think one of the things that I would just say is that we have to recognize white Christian nationalism as an anti-democratic force in our midst. And I have a whole chapter where I lay out that if people at the center of this movement have to martyr democracy in order to save the nation and be in control of it, they will do that. Democracy is not the sacred value. Power is the sacred value. And so I think the stake for anyone who wants, as I say, a multiracial, pluralistic democracy is for us to realize the situation we're in. The politician and activist Charles Creel told me once that, you know, and he says this on a documentary he made too, that the best situation to be in a war is when your enemy doesn't know they're in a war. And I think for many of us, it's kind of hard to realize that there is a whole set of actors and communities that really view themselves as having been in a war for a long time. And so that if that's their mindset, then the stake is for us to protect a democratic way of life. On an individual level, what does that mean? Well, I always have a couple of answers to this. I think that if you're around somebody who is unsafe or is abusive or toxic, then obviously the answer is that you can't have a relationship with them. But if you do have someone who is a friend or a family member or a colleague that actually wants to have discussions about these kinds of things, and they seem to hold some of these views, my encouragement would be to start not with belief, but to start with feeling. And I know this might sound a little weird, but here's what I mean. If I ask somebody who has diametrically opposite political and religious views from me, hey, how do you feel? It's 2023. You know, what are you looking forward to? What are you afraid of this year? What are you hurt about? Like, what has been hard in terms of just your life, your community? Who do you resent? Like, what do you resent? You seem to be full of grievance. What are you grieving? Have you lost something? Has someone taken something from you? What are you anxious about? You're raising kids. It's a scary world. What makes you lay up at night and think about those things? And the answers they give may include some elements that are going to make you cringe and or be incredibly offended. And so that's That's part of the conversation, perhaps, and it may not be one that you want to engage in. But if you are going to, I would say, if you go down this path of asking first about affect or emotion, then maybe they're going to let you do the same thing. And you can say, yeah, I'm afraid too. I'm actually really worried about this. I'm actually really hurt as well, or I'm disappointed, or I'm hopeful, or I'm looking forward to. And when you get to that level, you're no longer the scary person they heard about in church or on the talk radio show they listened to. You're not the uh, godless heathen, the demon possessed so and so, the serpent blooded blah blah blah, the secular humanist that wants to destroy, the newcomer to the nation who's trying to, all of the stuff that is spewed every day on Fox News and other places. All of a sudden, you're a human being who also is afraid, who also is worried, who also is scared, who also is angry. And that may be a way that all of those other things they've been told about you, the projections, all of a sudden get turned off, and you're just another human being in flesh and blood, trying to raise their kids, trying to make it through a hard time. And you might have a chance to form a connection there. Now, when it comes to being a Christian and a fellow Christian, I know the impulse is to say, well, they're not real Christians. These aren't real Christians. Sorry, not real Christians. And I just can't believe these folks. Disavowed, right? And I think a better response is to recognize that, and I know this is hard to do, is that these are Christian people. They're doing all of these things in the name of Jesus, and they really go to bed at night thinking of themselves as Christians. Now, as a Christian insider, as somebody who practices Christianity, you may say, well, yeah, but they're not good Christians. And that's okay. And I understand why you'd want to say that. But I'd also say that the responsibility for you is maybe even greater than someone who is not a Christian, because this is part of your family. These are people with whom you share a holy text. These are folks who you both go to bed at night understanding Jesus Christ to play a decisive role in your life. And so the family affiliation there, to me, requires at times more willingness to call out the tragedy of Christian nationalism and the misguidedness and the hurtfulness of it. And at times more compassion to say, hey, you're a Christian and I'm a Christian. Why don't we sit down and talk about this? Is there a way that we can get past trading barbs and actually talk as human beings? I think we've all had a situation where a family member of ours is maybe doing things and acting in a way that the family's disappointed or hurt or doesn't approve of, but they're family. And if there is a chance, there may not be, for there to still be a connection and a way to have a dialogue, then I'm not going to lie. I think the Christian person has an even greater responsibility to try to do that than the non-Christian person, as hard as that may be. And let's just be honest, as unpleasant as it may be.
So this first audience question is something you and I have talked about before, Brad, and something we talk about in our podcast series on about January 6th, but it's got some practical bite to it. So the question is, isn't the spiritual warfare lobby, great phrasing, in churches and theology and interpretation a predicate for Christian nationalism? Isn't it growing in influence? And if it is growing, how is that addressed and by whom? So spiritual warfare lobby, is it growing in influence? And how do we address that? And who addresses that?
So it is growing. And if you don't believe me, just listen to the series that we did. And Matt's research and all of Matt's evidence is on full display there. And you will be convinced after listening to that series that not only is it growing, but it's growing in a way that is alarming and actually quite frightening. But Matt makes a point at the end of the series that I think is one that's worth making here, is that it needs to be addressed by leaders who have any kind of public platform and who recognize that spiritual warfare language is dangerous to our public square. When you are using metaphors and symbols over and over and over again, telling your people to get their swords bloody, telling them to get ready to fight, to go to war, to go to battle, and you're encouraging them to do so by taking over neighborhoods, even if that's through a prayer walk or a prayer rally. If you're encouraging them to occupy spaces where they see themselves as warriors, even if it's as prayer warriors, there has to be a recognition that can be translated very easily into actual physical violence. And January 6th, 2 years ago, is a pretty good example of that. And if you listen to the series, you'll see the connections there. It needs to be addressed by everyone, including politicians, including sorry, looked like my microphone changed, including anybody who has a platform to say that this kind of language is dangerous. And Matt, you make the point at the end of the series that I think is really important, which is if leaders from any other religious tradition on a regular basis encouraged hundreds of thousands of people to think of themselves as warriors who have to get their swords bloody, there would be op-ed pieces, long-form essays, discussions on talk radio, and on news programs every night, wondering if these religious groups were not dangerous and were not extremists. Well, there is, and I just have to be very honest here, a very real sense of Christian privilege here, that it's really hard for media and others in our public square to admit that there's a chance that the Christian people, the white Christian people, might be the ones who are talking in a way that is violent and dangerous and poses a threat to the public square. But that is where we're at. And if we're not willing to confront that elephant in the room, then it's really hard to see how we hold this kind of growing discourse to account in any way.
So one of the things I like about the ICJS audience is that we get questions from all over, and this one is, I think, pointed. As someone whose mother fled Nazi Germany as a child and whose grandmother was murdered by the Nazis, how serious do you see the threat of anti-Semitism from white Christian nationalism now and in the coming years?
Yeah, and first, thanks for your question, and thanks for sharing that really obviously overwhelmingly difficult part of your family's history. The last month alone, last 2 months alone, I think, has shown us that anti-Semitism is a real and growing force in the United States. We've seen it from the likes of Ye or Kanye West. We've seen it from the likes of professional sports athletes. And we've seen it come, obviously, from alt-right and far-right actors and communities who are now, in many ways, increasingly intimate with the American right and the Republican Party in this country. I don't like to be alarmist, and I don't want to be alarmist today. I don't want to suggest that we are anywhere near the situation of 1935 or 1940 or 1942 Germany by any means. But I also think that it's worth, in any chance we have, in any setting that we are given, and any platform possible, to say that anti-Semitism is a threat to Jewish people in this country, and it's a growing force and something that must be addressed every time and every chance we can. And so, from the perspective of somebody who studies Christian nationalism, I will say that anti-Semitic forces have been at play in these communities for a long time, and they remain there, and they remain powerful. Nick Fuentes had a meal with Ye and Donald Trump just a couple of weeks ago, and was willing to spout some of the most hateful anti-Semitic rhetoric there is. So all of that to say, it's present. And I'll just say one more thing, and this is just very specific to the Christian nationalism topic. One of the ways that this rhetoric is allowed to kind of take root in these communities is there is a professed love of Israel, and yet, in my mind, a lack of love for actual Jewish people. The love for Israel comes from a theological framework that says that Israel is part of God's plan. It's a specific and special place in divine history, and that Israel as a place and as an idea must be protected, and it must be kind of respected and seen as special. But that rarely translates into actual love and respect for Jewish people, whether they are in the United States, whether they are in the state of Israel, or they are somewhere else. And so you see that quite often. I know, Matt, in your research, you see Christians who are willing to appropriate Jewish symbols and instruments, the shofar and so on. And so that is a very big part of everything we're talking about today.
Yeah, I mean, even on January 6th, you had Christians carrying Israeli flags. You had Christians blowing shofars, wearing talit, right? Side note, for our ICJS audiences, I'll be teaching a course in May on Christian Zionism, and even some of the ways that Christian Zionism segues into anti-Semitism. So mark your calendars for that. So I'm going to combine a couple questions here because I think they're related. The first one is, how do you motivate a public in a soundbite age to take on complexity in trying to learn? And somebody else really loved the phrase that you had about kind of thinking about American history and zooming in on the complexity of American history, and says, outside of academia, how do you see us encouraging that?
This is a $1 million billion question. So I'll do my best to give some sort of answer, but I'm not going to lie, it's not an easy one. What I'll say is that we do live in a soundbite age. We live in an age where it's increasingly difficult to have folks who have an attention span that lasts longer than a TikTok video or a tweet or something else. With that said, I think it's a mistake to think that people are not interested in what's happening around them, in the complexities and challenges of their world. I think it's a mistake to think that people don't want to learn. And so I think what we do see in the 2022 midterms is that many people did what a lot of the pundits said they wouldn't do. They voted for democracy as a kitchen table issue. They voted for reproductive justice as a kitchen table issue. So I think we need to take the American public seriously and say that if we're willing, and I'm now talking to scholars and journalists and intellectuals, if we're willing to do the hard work of wanting to create media or books or other resources that can help us understand the complexities that I discussed earlier, there is a public there that wants to learn about those things and will eat them up. We also have to find ways to frame them as not, giving into the kind of vision of the Christian nationalist who says you're nothing but an unpatriotic so and so and so and so. The reason I talk about the most patriotic thing you can do is attend to the stunning diversity of American history is because that is the most patriotic thing you could do. And if you give people the idea that that is actually a way to practice a form of loving their country, then they go to work, then they go to church, then they go to family dinner with that language. And they don't have to give in to the framing of them being these sort of, disturbing people that all they want to do is destroy everything that this country's proud of, and so on and so forth. So this is not an easy question. I don't by any means have all the answers to it, but I also think that we have to take people seriously, and scholars need and writers need to realize that they have a responsibility to write and think and teach in this way, because there's a lot at stake. And I think there's a possibility for us to do it together, but it requires work.
I think this will be our last question, unless we can squeeze in one more after it. So this is one of our participants in our meeting today from Idaho, and they write, the new Orange County is emerging in my state. Through anecdotal conversations, I've heard the story of Californians moving to Idaho so that they can, quote, raise their kids to use guns. And I'll just, as an aside here, say that is absolutely happening. And I have friends and acquaintances from California who have Christian national sympathies who are doing that. So they write, the redoubt is real and driving elections here. As a small church pastor in the Peace Church tradition, I keep trying to find a foothold in the larger community to raise awareness about what is happening. Thank you for providing resources. And then here's the question. Where is the Achilles heel in the Christian nationalist and redoubt movement?
It's a good question. And first of all, bless you for doing the work you're doing in a challenging context. Some of you may know, but the last chapter of the book is on the American redoubt movement that is, in my mind, really headquartered in Idaho, so to speak. And so just to give some context for anyone who's not familiar, there are hundreds of thousands of people moving from what would be considered more liberal and urban centers on the West Coast and other parts of the country to Idaho and Montana every year. If I'm not wrong, in 2018, 80,000 Californians moved to Idaho alone, and that was before the pandemic. Like Matt, I grew up in California. I could probably find right now, if I did all the work, 100 people in the state of Idaho who I went to school with or church with. And it sounds like Matt maybe could do the same thing. There's a real sense of them creating a white Christian, America in their own image, just as their forefathers and grandparents did to Orange County, generations ago. So all of that is part of the book, and I'm really glad it was brought up today. All right, so what is the Achilles heel, right? What is the Achilles heel? This is a really good question, and it's a really hard one. I'll point to a couple things, and again, I'm not sure I have any definitive answer. Happy for Matt to jump into, but I think there's a couple. One is that the vision is so exclusionary, and it is so myopic, and it is so extreme that it clearly leaves out so many people, and that there are folks sitting in congregations who have sons that are gay. There are people sitting in congregations who have family members who are immigrants. There are people who have stories that do not fit into this neat little narrative about the human condition in the United States that Christian nationalists, especially some of the extremist forces in Idaho, are giving. There are people who know that there are human elements that are being ignored when it comes to just this inhumane, hardcore rhetoric about spiritual warfare, about civil war, and so on. So I'll just go back to what I talked about earlier. This is hard work. It's plowing work. But if there's a chance in the peace tradition you work in to have a conversation with one person and to get past the demonizing, get past the propaganda, and get to just being two humans talking about fears and anxieties and love and care, people that matter to them, issues that matter to them, things that they hope for, then there's a chance that all of the hate and all of the reduction of the United States and the human condition to the little narrow, tiny, rigid, militant vision they're getting at church and on the radio, well, maybe some of that gets chipped away and chipped away and chipped away. And we all know that the data shows us, the science shows us that the way people often change their worldviews is by coming into contact with those who are affected by the issues, whether that's having a family member who is bisexual, whether that's having a family member who is an immigrant or a person of color, or that's having an incident in the healthcare system or by way of firearms that changes their understanding of those things. That's the Achilles heel. They're telling a story that does not match up to the magnanimity and beauty of the human condition. They're telling a story that only lets a tiny bit of the wonder of living on this earth into the frame. And you can only restrict it for so long with so few people before others start to see beyond the boundaries you've drawn. And they start to wonder, do we really have to live this way? Does resentment and grievance have to be our primary emotion? Does hatred have to be the thing that drives us all the time? Are there not ways that there are people with little kids, with parents they're taking care of, with vulnerabilities and frailties, with hopes and dreams, just like mine, that have been left out of this? And do we really need to live in this very tiny vision that we've been presented with? I think that's the Achilles heel. They're not telling a story that matches up to reality. But we have to be there, willing to walk with them to say, the real is scary. It's really hard to be a human being. But if you're willing, it can be really, really beautiful. It can be really full of wonder. And, maybe reconsider the way you look at things.
Brad's book is called Preparing for War, The Extremist History of White Christian Nationalism and What Comes Next. It just released this week. Go get your copies now. Please fill out the survey that will pop up as soon as you leave this Zoom call. We really appreciate your feedback, and it helps us as we craft future events to know kind of what topics and things you're interested in, how we can do this better. If you're looking for organizations that work on public scholarship on religion and are trying to help American society work through these issues, you can support ICJS. We make these events free to the public because we're a nonprofit. We would love to have your donations. You can go into our website and donate there and sign up for future events that we're doing. My colleagues and I are going to be co-teaching a course on the Crusades and the ways that the Crusades continue to inhabit our interreligious imaginations, even as Brad was calling attention to some of the Crusades image that shows up on January 6th. That will be starting, it'll be a 4-part series starting on January 17th. You can sign up for that on our website. And in 1 month, we'll be doing another one of these kind of 1 hour, 1 hour and a half events. It'll be an evening event with a group of our scholars. We'll be talking about these everyday experiences of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. How do we address that in the moment? How do we respond? Whether you're a Jewish person or a Muslim who's experiencing it as a victim, or whether you're an ally, a Christian or a non-Christian who wants to stand up to these things, how do we speak to that? So we'll be doing it kind of in a workshop format. You can register for those on our website. Thank you again for joining us today. Thank you, Brad, for making the time. And we would encourage you to keep coming back to all these things. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for having me.